The real reason Traoré rejects Zuma, exposed. Brothers and sisters, across Africa and the diaspora, a quiet storm has been building, one that exposes the difference between performing Pan-Africanism and living it. Recently, debates erupted after President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso reportedly refused to meet former South African President Jacob Zuma. To some, it looked like disrespect. But to those who understand the shifting winds of African geopolitics, this moment reveals something far deeper: the birth of a new leadership ethic, one rooted in truth, integrity, and decolonized memory. Because not every man who speaks of Africa loves Africa, not every elder carries wisdom, and not every revolutionary remained faithful once the microphone was placed in his hand. Traoré represents a rising generation determined to break with the contradictions of the past, leaders who refuse to bend, refuse to compromise, and refuse to shake hands with those who once enabled Africa's enemies. Tonight, we uncover why Traoré's silence speaks louder than Zuma's slogans. My friends, Africa stands at a crossroads, not of ideology, but of integrity. The continent is rising, shaking off decades of manipulated narratives, colonial influence, and the polished masks of leaders who speak one language on stage and another in smoke-filled rooms. And in this emerging struggle, two names have found themselves on opposite sides of history: Ibrahim Traoré and Jacob Zuma. To understand why Traoré has chosen distance over diplomacy, we must first revisit a chapter of African history many prefer to forget. In 2011, as NATO prepared to shatter Libya under the guise of a no-fly zone, Africa looked towards South Africa, the continent's geopolitical heavyweight, for a vote that would defend African sovereignty. Instead, the Zuma administration voted with NATO, opening the gates for Western powers to bomb an African nation, assassinate its leader, and plunge Libya into permanent chaos. It was a betrayal that reverberated across the continent. For decades, African unity had been upheld by figures like Nkrumah, Sankara, Lumumba, and Gaddafi, leaders who understood that Africa's liberation would never come through Western approval. Gaddafi, for all his flaws, championed a United States of Africa. His death did not just eliminate a man, it extinguished a dream, a continental project decades in the making. And Zuma, through that single vote, placed the knife directly into Western hands. This moment remains one of the darkest stains on South African foreign policy. And Traoré knows it. Because for true Pan-Africanists, Libya is not just history, it is a wound. But the story does not end with Libya. There is another shadow: Western Sahara, Africa's last colony. While the African Union recognizes the Sahrawi people's right to self-determination, Zuma took a different path. He traveled to Morocco and recognized their claim over land that does not belong to them. In doing so, he disregarded not only AU principles, but also the sacrifices of generations who fought for anti-colonial liberation. Traoré, a soldier who rose to defend Sahelian dignity, does not forget such contradictions. And then comes the issue that cuts even deeper: xenophobia. During Zuma's presidency, waves of violence targeted African migrants: Nigerians, Zimbabweans, Malawians, Mozambicans, people who had come to South Africa seeking opportunity. They were attacked in the streets, chased from homes, sometimes killed, always treated as outsiders in a nation whose very freedom was won with the blood of African brothers from across the continent. These attacks were not isolated incidents. They intensified under Zuma's watch, and even today, his political movement fuels rhetoric that frames Africans as intruders in African land. How can a man who tolerated or failed to stop violence against Africans claim the mantle of Pan-Africanism? Traoré understands that unity cannot be built on selective solidarity. A leader who smiles for cameras while other Africans bleed in the streets does not embody the Africa we are building. Let us go even further. In 2012, the Maracana massacre shook the world. 34 miners, black South Africans, were shot dead by police while protesting for fair wages from a British mining corporation. The tragedy unfolded under Zuma's leadership. Not a foreign occupation, not a colonial regime, but a democratically elected African government defending Western corporate interests over the lives of its own workers. The image remains seared into Africa's consciousness: peaceful laborers gunned down on African soil to protect profit. Traoré, who came to power on the promise of justice for ordinary citizens, could never align himself with such a record. But perhaps the most painful contradiction lies in Zuma's treatment of South Africa's youth. During the Fees Must Fall protests, students fighting for accessible education, a right, not a privilege, were met with arrests, repression, and state violence. Zuma's administration imprisoned the very generation meant to carry Africa forward. Ibrahim Traoré, known for protecting youth movements and elevating young voices, sees this as unforgivable. True Pan-Africanism does not jail students, it empowers them. And when Julius Malema, a fierce advocate for land reform and economic liberation, challenged the ANC establishment, Zuma played a role in his expulsion. Instead of embracing radical African-led transformation, Zuma defended structures that held black South Africans economically captive decades after apartheid. Traoré, who openly challenges oligarchic systems in the Sahel, cannot ignore this pattern. But beyond all the scandals, betrayals, and contradictions, there is something even more fundamental. Zuma belongs to a generation of leaders who failed to tell their people the truth, that South Africa's liberation was not won by the ANC alone. It was won with Angolan blood, with Zimbabwean sacrifice, with Mozambican resistance, with Namibian solidarity, and with Cuban soldiers who crossed an ocean to fight apartheid on African soil. Traoré is part of a new generation that demands honesty, accountability, and a rewriting of African narratives long manipulated by political elites. This generation sees unity not as a slogan, but as a sacred responsibility. So when talk emerges suggesting that Traoré refuses to meet Zuma, it must be understood not as disrespect, but as alignment with principle. Traoré represents the Africa of tomorrow, uncompromising, sovereign, fearless. Zuma represents the contradictions of yesterday, leaders who speak unity, yet act in ways that fracture it. This is not personal. It is symbolic. It is ideological. It is generational. Traoré is sending a message across the continent. The days of photo-op Pan-Africanism are over. Africa will no longer elevate leaders who betrayed Libya, ignored Western Sahara, enabled xenophobic violence, or defended foreign corporate interests over African lives. We are witnessing the dawn of a new era, one in which Africa demands coherence between speech and action, where liberation is not performed but practiced. A new Africa is emerging, one that honors Sankara, Nkrumah, Lumumba, and Gaddafi not in speeches but in actions. An Africa that refuses to bow, an Africa that refuses to forget, an Africa that refuses to shake hands with those who once handed our future to NATO, to corporations, or to neo-colonial institutions. If you believe in this rising Africa, share this message, raise your voice, and stay vigilant, because the future is being written now, not by those who speak the loudest, but by those who stand the firmest.